Okay, thanks everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for joining me. This is a privilege for me to be speaking to you on something that I'm really passionate about and has been most of my life for the past 25 years. As our introduction said, I'm Robert Juice Jr. I'm a professional landscape photographer, a printmaker, and a teacher. And on behalf of Canson Infinity, I've been an ambassador since 2011 for them. So needless to say, I love their paper. On behalf of Canson, I'll be sharing this presentation today titled From Capture to Paper. Now, getting to the stage where I'm fairly satisfied with the prints that I make today, maybe not tomorrow, but at least today, that means that the print conveys the essence of my emotional response to the landscape has taken me quite a while. Many years, many failures along the way, but I've also learned that it takes much, much more than just simply the technical aspects of making a print. So I'm going to share some steps that I rely on when I'm developing an initial idea into a finished piece of work, a fine art print, but I'm also going to start with some guiding principles that can help you, I hope they can help you, increase your creative potential and grow as a photographer. Now, the reason for this is because I really believe that the single most important aspect, the most important factor in making a good print is the quality of the image, the composition, what your image is about. So I want to present this as a kind of a creative journey rather than a formula or a set of steps, for example. This is my holistic approach to making prints, and I hope it resonates with you. So the first principle is clarity about what and why. And the most important question you can ask yourself is, what am I photographing and why? Or more broadly speaking, what do you want to say and why do you want to say it? Why do you want to share it with others? And I really can't overemphasize how important this is to creating prints that connect to the viewer. So this will help you to become more intentional as a photographer, more purposeful about your camera gear, about your editing decisions, about the paper selection, and especially your subject, your theme, right? The story you're trying to tell. And the story is not so much about the actual thing in your image. It's really just what you find interesting, what you find captivating, why you press the shutter. It's your emotional response. So you want to constantly be asking yourself this question: why am I photographing this? Now, being as clear in your mind as possible about what you're trying to capture, for example, helps me progress from my initial capture to the essence of what I was really responding to, right? The what and the why that I mentioned before. Being clear about why you find something interesting is very important. For me, it's a deep curiosity about how certain light make me feel, certain types of light make me feel. That's always impacted me emotionally. And so this is storytelling. It's not what your picture is about. It doesn't have to be something deep or grandiose, anything like that. It's just aware of what it is that inspired you to press the shutter button. Maybe just some light hitting some trees. But again, this is an important question that you should be asking yourself as often as possible. The second principle is my favorite, and I'd argue the most consequential aspect of photography, and that is compositional strength. This has the greatest influence on your work. Composition is the language that we use in pictures. It goes way back to the great landscape painters of the past, masters like Claude Lorraine, Caspar David Friedrich, J.W.M. Turner, and culminating for me in the Hudson River School of Painters, up where I live in the Hudson Valley, people like Albert Bierstadt. They were masters at composition. As you already know, the capability to make a technically perfect image today is greater than it's ever been. It really is easier than it's ever been, given all of the amazing tools that we have. But technical proficiency doesn't equal communication. That relies on time-tested fundamental principles of composition and design. Taking the time to learn visual design will improve your work dramatically. It definitely has for me. And that, of course, that translates into making prints. In fact, printing will force you to deal with design and composition, and particularly the flaws in your composition, because it'll become much more magnified once you're looking at a print in your hand. And this certainly was the case for me when I started printing. I just was not satisfied with the results that I was getting, and I thought it was something to do with my technical skills or what have you, but it really was the fact that the image wasn't conveying what I wanted it to convey, and I had to go back really to the weakest link in the chain, as it were, my compositional skills. One last point about design and composition is that it also provides a better foundation for you to be able to critique your own work. It prevents you from simply looking at things in your image, and instead you focus on what really makes the print work or not, the underlying design. So this is the fundamental process that you can make progress. The third principle is editing creatively. So this involves interpreting your raw file in a way that strengthens the composition. You should be thinking about the inspiration that you had to make the image to begin with, what inspired you in the field, what you find interesting, what sparked your curiosity, and carry that into the editing. I think that's a much more powerful way of making prints than simply looking at a raw file and saying, okay, what can I do here? Think back to what it is that you want to imbue the image with, and that will be your way of seeing, your way of kind of interpreting the world. You also want to increase the sense of depth and dimension in your images, and that again involves good editing skills. You want your image to be as dynamic as possible. This is a big topic, I totally understand that. I'm just trying to give you an overview that this can be a whole talk unto itself. But this is really crucial because you're going to be ultimately transferring that digital file onto a paper, a completely different medium, and you want to make sure that you are taking advantage of the paper's strengths and weaknesses. So here's my original raw file and the final edit, which contains, I think, what I was responding to in the field. Here's another original file or original capture. And then the final edit, which you can see it's a little more abstract. It conveys more the ephemeral quality of that particular moment for me. Realize that design and composition lies at the foundation of your editing decisions, or at least it should. At least that's what I try to promote in terms of making your editing as creative as possible. There's the original file, and here is the final edit that answers the why question for me, even if it's just something as simple as this. The fourth and final principle is selecting a paper that allows you to commit to a vision. Now, I know that the word vision can sound a bit intimidating. Maybe it sounds like you're supposed to have some grand artistic statement or something like that every time you press the shutter, but really what I mean by vision is something much more simple. It really just means paying attention to what matters to you, right? It's not pressure, it's permission. It's permission to be who you are and to grow in that process. Now this, of course, involves learning how different types of papers can change the perception of an image. And by far, this is the part that I love most about printing. It's this creative process of matching a beautiful paper, a paper from Canson particularly, with one of my images to produce something that goes, I think, way beyond what I see on a digital screen. It definitely has a much more, a greater impact on myself, and when you show someone a print, you definitely can tell that they respond to it in a totally different way than if you just show them on your phone or your iPad or your computer monitor. There's a certain tactile, beautiful quality to a print, particularly now that we're all digital. This brings it back into this analog medium that I think we respond to. It provides more opportunities for interpretation, as I mentioned before, with all these amazing papers that we have access to now, more experimentation, and it creates a deeper connection, as I said, to your work and your vision. I think you feel a greater affinity to your work when you're printing it. There's, again, something about the image that takes a life of on its own when you put it on a beautiful piece of paper. Now, selecting papers is, again, another very complicated topic. I'm going to share my opinion here. I'm going to share my way of doing this. I'm not saying this is the only way or the correct way, but it's the way that works for me and maintains the creative opportunities that I want to maintain in my work. So you can think of two ways of choosing paper. One is the paper first way, and in this, using this method, you evaluate, you look at different papers, and you figure out which ones you think you like the best, or maybe one or two, and then you print most of your work on those two papers, or three papers. The other approach, the one that I advocate for, the one that I very much prefer, is the image-first approach. I used to call this the image-centric approach before. So instead of finding one paper or one or two papers that you think work best or that you like, you evaluate each of your images based on what you're trying to convey. And you choose a paper that you think will best complement or strengthen that vision. Now, this allows you to be much more creative, much more unique with your prints, and you can use the qualities of the paper to add something to your images. Now, in order for you to do this, you need to learn the basic aesthetic qualities of any paper that you're going to use. This is a universal thing. It doesn't matter what manufacturer. Papers have different qualities, and it's important to understand what they are and how they will impact your work. So some ideas here. You can divide all papers from any manufacturer into two broad categories, aesthetic categories that you can actually see. And the two categories are matte papers and non-matte papers. And the reason for that is because that distinction determines the Dmax, or the amount of black that a paper can hold. And the greater amount of black a paper can hold, the more contrast it will have, the richer the shadows will be, the more contrast the printed image will exhibit. And this is very, very important because this overall contrast change impacts the way your image looks, the way it feels, the way others perceive it. So let's start with matte papers first, right? This is less Dmax, less contrast, less black. Again, this is not a good or a bad thing. This is not a value judgment. It's just the quality of the paper. Matte papers will give you a more refined surface because you tend to have some varying amount of texture, or you can have some texture. It definitely gives you a more fine art look and feel, if that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. Creates a more painterly, more suggestive, more nuanced, a quieter look to an image. And also, a matte paper is non-reflective, so you don't get the glare that you get with non-matte papers. A less photographic look to your image can impart, again, as I said before, more of a painterly, fine art look that we're familiar with, but it's not just enough to say that you want a painterly look. The image should already support that interpretation. So you can use matte papers for any subject. It doesn't have to be black and white, color, portrait, whatever. It's just a question of what you want to convey to the viewer. It all depends on the look and feel you want to convey. Now, I mentioned before the texture, which we have a lot more variety when it comes to matte papers, from smooth to very textured, can add a wonderful dimension to a print, because the texture in the paper, the regularity, can complement or blend with textures that you have in your image already. And that really creates a much more dimensional, almost a three-dimensional look to your print. So as a general idea, as a general principle, you want to, the texture should complement the image. It brings the image to life. So for me, if I have an image, for example, that has a lot of texture throughout, I will more likely be willing to use a textured paper because it's going to enhance those textures in the image and, as I said, make a three-dimensional look and feel to the print. However, if I have an image where I have textured surfaces and very smooth surfaces, then I will use less texture. The reason for that is because if you have smooth areas in your image and you use a textured paper, you will add texture to the areas that you want to keep smooth. And so you will be diminishing the differences in texture in your image. So again, if I've got very smooth areas, glass or clean sky or water, very smooth water, and then I've got some textured areas, I will use a smooth paper because then the textures in the image will remain differentiated, as it were. Okay, let's talk about non-matte papers now. So this is a big category. You can think of gloss, luster, satin, fiber papers, which are papers that try to emulate the traditional darkroom prints. These have higher Dmax, higher black density. They hold more black. They often will have very smooth surfaces. They will be shinier to some degree. And they definitely generate a more of a photographic look and feel because, of course, we're familiar with photo papers from the past. They're much more common from days of past, and then they're more literal, if you will. This is a great choice When you want high contrast, you want maximum aggressiveness, you want an image or print to be in your face, so to speak, very loud. And tonal separation and shadows, also something you should consider when you're choosing a paper. If you need separation in the shadows, you need more density, therefore a non-matte paper will give you more separation in the shadows. Again, assuming that that is something that you want in your composition. That's why the composition is so important, because it will dictate what you want to emphasize in the image. Here's an example of an image that is a print that is printed on Baryta Photographique. This is one of Canson's really nice smooth papers with a lot of DMAX, again emulating the look and feel of Baryta papers of the past. And here you can see that the image, I think, warrants using a paper that has a lot of black density and a lot of separation in the shadows. Here's Platine Fiber Rag, another beautiful Canson paper. This paper is similar to Baryta, but it has this surface detail, if you will. I call it like a grain or surface interest that I just think adds a little bit of a beautiful look to a print, but still has this black density. Now, you don't have to use every paper made by a manufacturer or try every paper made by a manufacturer, because let's face it, chances are that many of the papers that are out there won't complement the kinds of images that you're making. In fact, you're already probably doing this when you choose papers. You're thinking about the kind of images that you make, and you're saying, okay, I think these papers will work best. And I'm just suggesting that you change that around and say, here are the papers that I think work best for my images. Now let me look at each image and decide which paper I think will complement it best, will bring out its strengths. So for me, the kind of work that I do, I'm generally doing landscapes. I like a very serene, quiet, sort of reflective type of image. And so I'm generally going with 2 matte papers, and then when I need a little more aggressiveness, a little more density, then I will go with 2 non-matte papers. I'm using Arche 88, which is one of Canson's amazing papers made at a mill in France that is very smooth, but has wonderful black for a matte paper. And if I want a little texture, then I'll go with something like BFK Reeves, which adds a little texture, but it isn't overly aggressive. So even if I use it in an image that has sky, it's not going to make my sky look completely textured. And when I need more density, as I mentioned before, same kind of difference. Baryta for the super smooth surface, or something like Platine Rag, which adds a little bit of interest on the surface, but still maintains this look and feel. But at the end of the day, I'm thinking really about the kind of effect that I want to have on the viewer, what I want the image to convey. It's not about making every image look loud and aggressive. It's about, again, being nuanced with your work and letting the image tell you kind of what it needs, and that comes from inside. So for an image like this, where I want the most amount of contrast, and the reason for that is I want to accentuate the highlights, I want to accentuate the shadows, I want to really bring out the sheen on the rocks, the wetness of the water, I want to convey a sense of the water moving, the sound of the water, then I'll use something like Platine, because that's going to really maintain that high level of contrast and give it that sheen that I think I want. Totally different kind of image here, right? A matte paper here is almost definitely what I'm going to use, because it'll make the image feel less literal, less photographic, right? It's more like a painterly approach, more quiet. Again, it complements the kinds of things that I'm attracted to, the kind of ideas and feelings that I want to convey in my work. The key thing here is to consider that all of the factors that make an image successful for you, think about those things and then choose a paper accordingly. And this will take some trial and error, of course. I unfortunately have to say that I've wasted a lot of paper learning these principles, but it's just part and parcel of progressing, of learning. Even with a black and white image, for example, here, a matte paper is ideal for me because on the whole, it conveys the moment that I want to express. Last thing I want to say is that understanding a paper's characteristics is critical here. once you start to think of prints as an aesthetic combination of the paper and the image, then you have a much better sense of which paper will work best for your image. That's one of the reasons why I love Canson papers, right? They really cover the whole spectrum of the variety that I can have, from very textured to very smooth, high Dmax, low Dmax, and yet I get really the same results across all of their papers, regardless of which one I use. I can really just focus in on the aesthetic qualities of the paper and how it complements my work. So let me take you through a couple of images here and my particular workflow, both capturing the image, how I went about editing the image, and then how I printed it. So here I'm on the Hudson River, where I live, on a very cold morning, and I see these beautiful, amazing textures, these blocks of ice, various shapes and sizes, this beautiful warm light that's pushing its way into the coldness of everything else. So this is my first capture, so to speak, the first time that I say, okay, let me try this here. And quite often for me, creatively, the first image where I got my tripod set up and I press the button, that's kind of the most important image for me. And the reason for that is because it now allows me to start to get a sense of creatively what I want to do. It sort of gives me something to work with. It defines the problem, right? Photography, particularly landscape photography, is problem solving. And the more you define the problem, the easier it is to start to come up with ideas. So this is my first attempt. I get a little bit closer. I'm trying to avoid the busyness on the left-hand side. Now it feels like there's too much on the right. The image feels a little bit out of balance. I'm using these design principles that I mentioned before, trying to use the entire frame so that the viewer has a way to look through the image and I lead them to the most important part of the scene. I get a little bit closer, trying to simplify, use some leading lines. Of course, I'm also very cognizant of what the light is doing, and so that is something you have to pay attention to, because that's changing regardless of what you're doing. It's constantly changing, and as it changes the relationship of the things that you have in your frame. Still trying to simplify, getting a little bit closer, but I realize that it's not quite working to my satisfaction. There's something missing, and so I decide to make a drastic change and really eliminate as much as possible and just strip the image down to the bare essence of what I think I want to capture. So I get very close, a lot lower to the scene. I'm trying to avoid the sun for some reason, I don't know why, but this doesn't quite work. It's missing the energy, so I shift my camera back to the left-hand side, and that's my final image. This is using a Canon 1DS Mark III, which is an older camera that I've had for a very long time. It's kind of an extension of my hand because I can use it without looking at anything. That's how long I've had it and used it. This is 1/40th of a second at f/18. These days, I would probably use f/16 to avoid a bit of diffraction, but this is many, many years ago, and so live and learn, as they say. 21mm lens and no filters. I do all of my editing and my printing in Lightroom Classic and have since Lightroom Beta. Very infrequently, I go out to Photoshop to do something special. That was more often in the past, and now that now that Lightroom is gaining all of these local adjustments, as you saw Julian talking about here before, I stay in Lightroom now 99.9% of the time. So this is the original capture. I'm just going to walk you through the adjustments in Lightroom. I'm not going to actually do them, otherwise we'll be here forever. This is with some basic adjustments applied. The basic panel in Lightroom where you set your white point, you set your black point, you set your profile. Profile is very, very important. Don't just use the profile that is set by default, because the profile, you see that's what I've half highlighted up there. The profile is how Lightroom is going to render the raw file, and that can bring out colors, it can bring out more or less contrast, it can change the saturation or the richness of the color. So I always go through the profiles and see which one gets me closer to what I'm trying to do. This way there's less work to do for me with the adjustments, and I get a better vision of what I'm trying to achieve. By the way, the white point and the black point are critically important when it comes to printing, because you could think of a piece of paper as, let's say, being a bucket, and you want to fill that bucket with as much tonal value as possible to get everything out of the paper. If your image has something that should be solid white or greater, like the sun, which is beyond solid white, then you want to make sure that you set those properly. Otherwise, you're going to have a print that looks flat. If you've ever experienced that, one possible thing to look at is, are you maximizing your tones? Are you setting the proper white point to get the full richness out of the paper? I apply a tone curve to get a little more contrast. I use the tone curve in Lightroom for that. Then I use the color mixer to pull down the blue channel, and that just adds what I call a virtual polarizer. It just darkens the blues in the sky a tiny bit, maybe a little bit in the water as well. That just helps to bring out the shapes that are lighter. I rarely use a polarizer these days, by the way, because the color mixer and the blue channel in particular is so powerful. It allows you to lower the blues, and you can always undo that if you like. You're not committed to a polarizer, plus you don't get uneven skies if you have a very wide angle lens. So the color mixer very powerful for that. Then I apply some sharpening in Lightroom. Again, nothing too out of the norm here. Being careful to make sure that I'm using the right settings, low radius, because I have lots of edges, so I want to make sure that I sharpen those edges as good as possible. And then one of the most important adjustments that I think you can make is the masking adjustment in Lightroom for sharpening. And the reason for that is because this masking adjustment allows Lightroom to what should receive some sharpening and what shouldn't. And it's 99.9% of the time always right. Any area that is smooth shouldn't get any sharpening. Any area that isn't smooth should get some sharpening. And the reason why this is so useful, particularly for printing, is because you will create a much more aesthetic sharpening. Because now, as you know, the viewer's eye is attracted to areas that are sharper. Areas that aren't sharpened will tend to recede, or you'll have more difference in areas that are sharp versus not sharp. All of this contributes to making an image that is much more dimensional, less flat, if you will. Then I decide I want to make the sky a little bit darker. Again, just to maybe push the light from the sun. And so I add a simple linear gradient, nothing too precise, just pulling down the exposure, or highlights in this case, a little bit. Then I do some dodging and burning, one of my favorite things to do. This is just a way to accentuate the most important parts of the image. Not dodging and burning throughout, but where the dominant part of the image is. So here I'm dodging the foreground, some of the areas where you can see the light is coming through. I want to make those really come out to generate this energy of the light that I certainly experienced when I was there. So that's dodging using a basic brush. And then I apply some burning. Typically the burning is similar to where the dodging is, just on the dark side. So darkening some of those shadows, making it a little bit richer, and I'm done. So here's the before and the after. Seems like very simple adjustments, but it makes a dramatic difference in where your eye goes, leading the viewer into the picture, and it, for me, I hope, tells the viewer what's most important to me. Here I am getting ready to print the image, so I'm soft proofing, and I use the soft proof module basically to see how the image is going to look on a paper. The key thing about the soft proof module is this is where you have to decide what paper you're going to use. So you have to kind of commit to at least thinking about a paper, and you also get to choose the rendering intent. That simply means how Lightroom is going to compress the colors from the original image down to the color space of the paper, right? Because there's no paper that can hold all the colors in an image. It's just a much smaller gamut. So the rendering intent allows you to see how Lightroom is going to do that. There's two different ways of doing that, and it's just a visual check. There's no right or wrong way here, either relative or perceptual, and I go with relative, with perceptual actually here because it looks closer to me. I'm in the print module now, lay out my print, make sure that my settings are right in the printer. I know that's an easy one sentence word, it sounds simple for one sentence, but yes, you have to go through and make sure that you got your print settings correct, your media settings correct. That's really key, although simple, but you can make lots of mistakes there. You want to make sure that's all set. And then in the print module, the most important thing here is make sure that you are using a profile, and I use the native resolution of the printer method, if you will. That means that I interpolate the image in Lightroom to the native resolution of the printer that I'm using. And that's fairly straightforward. If you're using a Canon printer, that's going to be 300 ppi. If you're using an Epson printer, that's going to be 360 ppi. Now, if you notice up here, my ppi is set to 600. Now, why 600 if I said Canon is 300? Well, you set it to 300 if your native resolution, so in other words, the native resolution of my image at that size is 300 or less. Then I set it to 300. But in this case, printing this at 13 by 19 with a 23 megapixel image, something like that, the native resolution is 345. So if I interpolate this to 300, I'm throwing away information. I don't want to do that. So I interpolate up to 600. Why? Because now when you send it to the printer, when I send it to my Canon, it only has to divide the resolution of the image by half, and that's a very simple mathematical calculation versus, sending it at some other number. Again, this relies on the concept or the idea, or actually the fact, that any image you send to your printer will get interpolated to the printer's native resolution. That's the only way it can pass through the printer's pipeline and go to the printhead. So I prefer to do this in Lightroom, which has a much better interpolation method than your operating system or the printer. And I also get to apply some sharpening in Lightroom. And the sharpening in Lightroom is intelligent enough to know how much it should sharpen based on how far I'm interpolating, how much I'm interpolating. So much better results when you do it in Lightroom. And that's the finished print. I printed this on Canson Infinity Platine. Remember, Platine has a high Dmax. That means that I'm going to get more black, more richness out of the image, and I really wanted to convey the energy of the image. If you want to come up later and take a look at the print, that's it here. Let me grab this one while I'm there. All right. Okay, I think I have time for one more. Okay, here's another example, another scenario, totally different time, different place. This is in Arches National Park. I like to throw myself into the deep end, which means I just drive out somewhere, get out and start walking, and have no idea what I'm going to photograph. I have no idea what I'm going to find, but I know that I'm in a place that makes me feel amazing, and I know that the light is going to be pretty nice on this particular day. I'm very familiar with this park, so I'm comfortable, but again, I have no idea, and that's what I love. I just love this improvisational aspect of landscape photography because it forces you to really remain present and remain attuned to what's happening in the field. This catches my eye, this texture of the sand as the light comes up and creates all these leading lines into the picture. Again, as I said before, the first picture is the one that kind of anchors me and says, okay, here's the problem. Something about this I find interesting. This isn't working, of course, because there's some distractions, a little green bush in there, but I have something to work with. I get a little closer maybe I'm not really paying attention to that green bush. We all do this. We sort of try to ignore things, but it's still there. I can see it every time I look through my viewfinder. Okay, I got to get rid of this thing, but I kind of like where I'm going. So I move more to the left, get up and move my feet, and I get rid of that bush. And now it feels a little better. I got rid of that bush, but I can see, not when I'm looking through my camera, that there's much more, there's a certain vastness to the landscape that I'm in that I'm not capturing in the scene, and that's what I want to kind of put into the scene. So I switched to a horizontal format to capture that scene. You can see now the La Salle Mountains way in the distance and the desert behind it, and that gets to more of what I want, except that now it's a little bit too ambiguous width-wise. There's too much going on the left-hand side. I want to concentrate. I want to make the composition stronger, more refined. So I switch back to a vertical, but now I am able to include that little bit on the left, and that's my final capture. This is with a different camera. This is with an Olympus EM1 Mark II at f8, ISO 200 with a 24 millimeter lens, or effectively 24 millimeter lens. No filters again. So I bring this into Lightroom again. That's the original raw file. Again, applying basic adjustments. Notice that I expand my histogram to make sure that I got the best whites and the best blacks, or the proper white and the proper black point. I don't mind if some of the blacks in the cliffs in the background go a little dark. I'm not interested in the detail back there. I'm really interested in maintaining the sense of texture and this amazing landscape that you can just put your hand out and touch it, and it's just everywhere. I apply some sharpening. Again, straightforward, low radius to make sure that I capture all of the detail in the scene. By the way, in Lightroom, you should always be zooming in at 100% or use the preview on the right there to see the amount of sharpening that you're adding to an image. It's very hard to see it when you're zoomed out. If you've got a 4K monitor, which I highly recommend if you don't have one and you're thinking about, get a 4K, because that really allows you to appreciate the texture and the detail in your image, and that definitely translates to making prints. Again, the all-important masking feature. Notice here how Lightroom completely masks out the sky. So black means there's no sharpening going to the sky or some of the shadow areas, but all of the sharpening is being applied. White reveals, black conceals, all the sharpening is going to the foreground, exactly where I want it. What does this mean? It means that it lets the sky recede back in the print, and it brings the foreground forward. Now I add a little bit of an adjustment, burning into the valley in the middle there. I think it's a little too bright, and I just want to bring it down so that it doesn't, I do want to subdue it a bit so that I push it back into the distance. Again, thinking about the foreground. And then I add, again, a very simple graduated filter on the left-hand side to kind of darken that side of the sky and make the sky a little more even across from left to right. And so there is the original and the after on the right-hand side, the comparison. Now I go into the soft proof module again. I have to decide on a paper, and this time I am definitely going to go for a matte paper for a couple of reasons. I'm going to use a matte paper because I want the texture. I'm thinking about the texture in the paper and how that's going to complement the image. Number two, I don't need shadow detail, as I mentioned before. The shadows and the cliffs in the back, those can be kind of dark. I don't mind that. It gives it a more of an analog feel, if you will. But I really want to maintain the textural quality, and so I go for BFK Reeves, which is a beautiful paper that has it's a mold-made paper, which means that it has a very varied texture. It's not a pattern-like texture. Mold-made papers create a very varied texture, which is really nice. So that's what I decided I'm going to use. One of the tip that I can give you is, and this only applies to matte papers, when I print on matte papers, I will typically add a little more texture or clarity to the image. And that's because a matte paper is just inherently a little bit softer, and adding a little bit more clarity to the image will just bring out a little bit more of that definition. I take it into the print module. Once again, my native resolution for this image at this size print, which is 13 by 19, is 355. So I'm well above my printer's native resolution of 300. So I'm going to interpolate it in Lightroom to 600. Once again, I send it to the printer, it divides it in half, and the printer doesn't have to do any work except print exactly what I send it. I make sure that I select the right profile, of course, very important. And that's the finished print. So a couple of final thoughts that I can leave with you. Number one is to be true to yourself. Just as important as the composition, be sensitive to what it is that you're thinking about. Be sensitive to why it is that you're photographing in general, and also just what you find curious about, the thing that you're making an image of that you want to make a print of. Focus on composition, because that is the most important element of a successful print. Again, in my opinion, we can all think of amazing prints that we've seen in museums or what have you. And sure, we look at the quality of the print, and that's impressive if there's good quality in it. But what captures your attention is just a story, something that captures your imagination, something that really conveys what the photographer was thinking. Never stop practicing, because never stop practicing the fundamentals. That's very important there. Because the fundamentals are the foundation that creativity is built on. The fundamentals are that's your foundation, that's your scaffolding, if you will. That's hard these days because there's so much going on, so many things, demanding our attention. And so, in addition to the fundamentals, keep things simple. It's absolutely crucial, I think, to maintain your focus on what matters to you, what makes photography and printing meaningful for you. That's the only thing, really, the only thing for me that's going to keep you inspired, and it's going to keep you learning in your own personal journey. You can find out more about me at my website, robertrodriguezjr.com, and also check out the Canson website for upcoming webinars that I'll be doing for them in the future. Thanks very much.